Or left? There you go. Here. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Winter Newman Lecture, Science in the Face of God, with our speaker, Father Robert J. Spitzer. This is the second installment in our lecture series on faith and reason. Whether you're a student, a faculty member, or a member from the larger community, we want to welcome you to this talk. My name is Becca Bradley, and beside me up here is my good friend, Connor Kelly. We work for the Newman Center at Oregon State University, which is a Catholic campus ministry to put on events like this one to the greater OSU community.
So as Becca mentioned, my name's Connor. I graduated from American University in the summer of 2024, and I moved to Oregon this past August to work with the Newman Center. I've been attending Newman lectures for the past year, both in person at American University and in the form of online webinars like this one streamed from Oregon State. Through this series, I've been exposed to intellectual formation that's expanded my worldview and deepened my understanding of Christianity, church, and my own faith.
We especially would like to welcome anyone who is here for their first Newman lecture, and also for the people joining us on Zoom. Father Spitzer is just one of the amazing speakers who is presenting on thought-provoking topics surrounding philosophy, social issues, and religious belief. We anticipate that through this lecture and the participant questions, together we can come to a deeper understanding of how science and faith complement each other.
So before we get started, I'm going to take a moment to explain the order of the night. Father Spitzer will speak for about 45 minutes. Then, following the presentation, there will be time for Q&A. On the slides of Father Spitzer's presentation, you'll notice that there's a QR code. If there are any questions you have throughout the presentation that you want answered during the Q&A section, you can scan the QR code and fill out your questions there. And then we'll take a few questions for the Q&A section. And yeah, we welcome all questions. However, for the sake of time, we ask that you only ask one and you try to keep it as concise as possible. Thank you. And now it is my distinct honor to introduce a good friend of mine. He's the director of the Newman Center, so give me a hand in welcoming up Father John Potts.
So on behalf of the Newman Center at Oregon State University, welcome to this winter edition of the Newman Lectures. As Becca was saying, the Newman Lectures aim to foster this important dialogue between faith and science. We want to create a space for this dialogue within the campus, the university campus, with a firm conviction that these two realities, the Christian faith and rigorous science, never really contradict each other, but rather enrich and illumine each other. And this was actually also Cardinal Newman's conviction. He spoke of how science can do the groundwork for the right reception of faith, though it cannot replace the act of faith. In one of his works, Cardinal Newman writes, "Science gives us the grounds of premises from which religious truths are to be inferred, but it does not set about inferring them, much less does it reach the inference. That is not its province. It brings before us phenomena and it leaves us, if we will, to call them works of design, wisdom, or benevolence, and further still, if we will, to proceed to confess an intelligent creator." This is what we think will happen if we rigorously and carefully analyze with all that science can offer us the Shroud of Turin, this amazing artifact. So allow me now to introduce our speaker for tonight. As president of the Magis Center since 2009, Father Robert Spitzer has led the effort to create the largest science-based faith and reason institute in the US, producing parish programs, catechetical and youth ministry programs, and web-based resources. Father Spitzer has published 18 books, dozens of academic articles, and 12 video series. He served as president of Gonzaga University from 1998 to 2009. And during that time, he led an effort to significantly increase programs and curricula in faith, ethics, service, and leadership. So now please join me in welcoming Father Robert Spitzer.
much, everybody. It's a real honor to be with all of you tonight. And as always, I will just begin, as I always do, with a prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. And Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for your many blessings to us, and send your Holy Spirit down upon us now to inspire, guide, and protect us, so that everything we do will be brought to fruition in your will. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Mary, seat of wisdom, pray for us. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Tonight, we're going to be talking about, without a doubt, the most scientifically tested historical artifact in human history. About 170 scientific tests and analyses have been done on this artifact, the Shroud of Turin, the purported burial cloth of Jesus, which I surely do believe is the burial cloth of Jesus, but I have to give you my reasons for that so that you might see that it is a reasonable and responsible conclusion. It's the most unique image that has ever been produced in human history, because it has so many enigmatic dimensions, including imaging from the inside of the body as well as the outside of the body, and in perfect three-dimensional proportionality to each other. So the inside imaging is in perfect three-dimensional proportionality to the flesh surrounding it, for example. We see also that these are genuine blood stains, and there are 372 of them, and those 372 blood stains are without a doubt human blood, as we shall talk about later. The blood actually came upon the shroud before the actual imaging. This makes it very difficult for any forger to have produced it, but we must talk about that at the end of the program. So in essence, this is a most unique, most scientifically tested historical artifact, which I think there is reasonable and responsible preponderance of evidence to show that it is the burial cloth of Jesus, with evidence not only of his passion, but also of his resurrection in power and glory that is embedded on the shroud. So let's get right to the most controversial part about this relic. And that, of course, is the 1988 carbon dating. Many of you may remember that in 1988, the cloth was carbon dated to between 1250 to 1350, more or less in that range. This was done by 3 laboratories that were very credible and esteemed, and so supposedly could give very accurate information about this. But we're going to talk about a little systematic error in the actual reporting of the data in a little bit later. But that's what happened. So a lot of people thought for quite a while that the 1988 carbon dating disproved that this could really be from the 1st century, and therefore be of the to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. So what has happened since then? Well, a lot of things. I'm just going to mention 3 things in passing here. I'm going to do it quite rapidly, because I do want to get to the Passion Resurrection data as quickly as possible. But first, Dr. Tristan Casabianca and his colleagues in both France and Italy actually had asked the British Museum for the raw data from the carbon-14 dating test that had been done. And basically, you couldn't arm wrestle this data out of the British Museum for almost 29 years. Finally, Casabianca filed a Freedom of Information Act, got the data released, and after subjecting it to a standard statistical analysis frequently done in C14 tests, they discovered that there was so much heterogeneity from within each of the subsamples of the sample, that the 8-centimeter sample that was taken, and so much heterogeneity among the samples. In other words, there's too many diversification of years there, that it indicated very, very likely systematic error in the carbon dating, and we'll talk about what produced that systematic error. One systematic error is one across the board, and I'm going to explain this at the end of the talk. But for right now, Casabianca and Company published in Oxford's a great journal of archaeology called Archaeometry. They published their results and discounted the 1988 carbon dating as being completely invalid, not only for dating the shroud to the Middle Ages, but for any other age for that matter, because heterogeneity on a really compounded scale is a very bad indication of a valid carbon date. What happened after that? 4 other dating tests were done. I'm going to go from the most recent to the least recent. The most recent one is a really important dating test done by Dr. Liberato Di Caro and his colleagues over at the Italian National Labs. They did what's called a wide-angle X-ray scattering test. In that dating, well, I won't go through the particulars of the dating because of the time limit here, but I'll just say they dated the shroud to between 55 to 74 AD with a 95% confidence level. Now, the important thing about this dating test is it has been peer-reviewed multiple times. So it is a very accurate dating test. And secondly, it does not use C14. And as we shall, carbon 14, and as we shall see in this example of the Shroud of Turin, if there was a strong neutron emission that came from the body, which is very probably the case, then there's just no way you can use a carbon dating method, any carbon-based method for dating, because of course, as we'll see in a moment, the neutrons would throw it off. So nevertheless, this wide-angle X-ray scattering does not use carbon dating, and it accurately dates the shroud to between 55 to 74 AD. Let's go to 3 other dating tests that were done prior to that one. That one was done in 2022. The one that was done prior to that by Giulio Fanti, he did 3 dating tests: Fourier transformed infrared spectroscopy, a Raman laser spectroscopy, and a mechanical compressibility and tension test. When you weight all of these things in terms of their dependence on carbon for getting enzyme and dating and aging results, basically the date of all 3 with a weighted average comes out to 90 AD, again plus or minus about 150 years in this case, with a 95% confidence level. So when you put all the 4 dating tests together, it seems very, very likely on the basis of all 4 non-carbon based tests, it seems very likely that the date of the shroud is mid-1st century. Let's go into 2 other things, the place, which will become very important for dating as well. There's pollen fossils and pollen grains that are embedded in the shroud. I'm just going to cut to the chase here. The most numerous, by far, pollen grains on the shroud, they come from the region of northern Judea and Jerusalem. And so you can pretty much see that the shroud, 3/4 of the pollen grains, by the way, come from that region. 14 of them are unique to that region, and 3 of them have never, ever been found on anything, anywhere outside of northern Judea and Jerusalem, except, of course, on the Shroud of Turin. So essentially, I think it is, very reasonable to conclude that the shroud came from the northern Judea and Jerusalem region. That's with a high level of confidence. We can also see that it remained in Jerusalem, northern Judea, probably had to remain there for at least 3 centuries, much of which was in the open air. So this is important. And we also see the same kind of evidence, not 3/4 of the grains, but we also see a large percentage of the pollen grains comes from Edessa, Turkey, and then another large percentage from Constantinople, Turkey. The least number come from Turin, Italy, and from Chambéry, France, where the shroud was, since it was, proclaimed to have, been in the possession of Geoffroy de Charnay, in the 1300s. Right after that, the shroud basically took a tour, and we know exactly where it was. Now, why is all this pollen evidence so significant? Not just for tracing the journey of the shroud from Jerusalem to Edessa to Constantinople to Chambéry to Turin, Italy. Why is it so important? Because if that dating test, the carbon dating test, is correct, then the shroud is only 700 years old. But we have a provenance, a proven provenance of the shroud as being only in Chambéry, France, and only in Turin, Italy, over that 700 years. How in the world can you explain centuries worth of pollen accumulation from Jerusalem, northern Judea, Edessa, Turkey, Constantinople, Turkey, which had to come prior to Turin, Italy, and Chambéry, France? I mean, the idea of a 700-year-old dating becomes preposterous at this point. Now, let's just take a look at what's also important here, and I'm going to do this quickly, and I'm going to get back to this topic in the future. So why did the 1988 carbon dating, why did it have a systematic error? Why did it give a false reading? I mean, after all, these labs were very, obviously, prestigious labs and so forth. The reason, quite simply, is neutrons. If this body, and I'll talk about this in terms of particle radiation at the end of the talk, if the body had a strong emission of neutrons from the body, what would have happened is that, as you probably know, linen is composed of cellulose, and cellulose is composed of N13. That's the normal nitrogen element, but also there is a tremendous amount of N14, the nitrogen isotope that's in the linen, that the shroud images on. So, there's an easy formula that Tom Phillips identified way back in 1988. N14, that's the nitrogen isotope, plus neutron, let's say there was a strong neutron emission, yields C14, carbon 14 plus proton. Now, if that is the case, then if there was a strong neutron emission from the body, which I think is a provable conclusion from two other pieces of evidence we'll talk about momentarily, if there was a strong neutron emission from the body, then it probably transformed a large amount of N14 into C14. And, there was a test done, we'll talk about it, from Robert Rucker, who with his colleagues used the Monte Carlo N-particle software to show that in that sample, you could have expected additional carbon 14 in that sample that would have moved the date from basically 33 AD right up to 1,240 years to 1,350 years, right? 1,250 to 1,340 years beyond 33 AD, simply because of the C14 and the carbon emissions that reached that particular place where the sample was taken from. I think it is pretty clear that what happened was the C14, the additional C14 produced by neutron emissions, which we can prove from other data, was responsible for the systematic error in the dating of the shroud. Enough said on this. Let me get to the bloodstains on the shroud and the evidence of Jesus's passion that's on the shroud. As I said before, there are 372 bloodstains on the shroud. All of those bloodstains have human hemoglobin, AB blood type, human immunoglobulins, human whole blood, human bilirubin, etc. So obviously this couldn't be paint, it couldn't be dye or anything, right? Paint and dyes don't have blood type. They don't have hemoglobin that belongs specifically to humans, human immunoglobulins and whole blood and so forth. So obviously, this is real blood in these 372 blood stains. Secondly, there is an admixture of creatinine and ferritin on the blood stains on this cross, on this cloth. Normally that mixture, that synthesis of creatinine and ferritin occurs when a person undergoes a heavy polytrauma. So this is particularly important here because Jesus underwent clearly a heavy polytrauma, obviously tortured in all the ways we know from the Gospels. Again, we can see that the bloodstains are arranged on a vertical axis, so we can see that the serum is pulling away from the plasma on a vertical axis, indicating that the body was probably hanging vertical for at least 1 to 2 hours, at least. So again, corresponding to the accounts of Jesus's passion. Let's get to the. Okay, let's go to the actual relic itself, and see what it tells us about the passion of Jesus. First of all, we can see that the man in the shroud was crowned with thorns. The kind of thorn that is used, it's very identifiable morphologically. You can see that the kind of thorn that was used in this crown was what we now today call a Syrian Christ thorn. But it is a Syrian thorn, a large Syrian thorn with adverse curvature. You can see it on the there embedded on the face of the man, the head of the man, pretty clearly. It is a Syrian Christ thorn. It comes from northern Judea and Jerusalem, very clear. The most plentiful thorn there. It's woven into not a medieval European crown, which is a circlet going around the head, but rather as a crown with a top on it, which would have been done in that Middle Eastern and Syrian region. That would have been the more normal shape of the cross. And of course, we only have one crucifixion in the whole history of crucifixions that we know of. Only one where a man was crowned with thorns. And that was, of course, Jesus Christ. Why? Because of the claim that he was King of the Jews. Enough said. The second thing that we see, even more importantly for identifying the man, we can see that between the fifth and the sixth ribs, going up, into the thoracic cavity there, you can see that something like, a Roman legionnaire spear, with the elliptical kind of, head, has gone right up between that fifth and sixth rib. It seems like it proceeded right up at the angle it's going in, right? The ribs are going to force it up at a particular angle, and you can see that this spear is going right up into the thoracic cavity. It pushes, it's going to nick the heart as it goes past the heart, and it's going to go right into the pleural cavity there. Now, the pleural cavity is the one that's surrounding the lungs. And of course, this pleural cavity is just being loaded up with a clear liquid called pleural fluid. But the important word here, it's a transparent fluid, this pleural fluid, and it's gathering and coming under greater and greater pressure, because in a crucifixion, the man has to pull himself up, right? And in order to breathe. So when that happens, right, the pleural cavity fills with the pleural fluid. So you can see that the spear is going to go right up, nick the heart, go right up into the pleural cavity, and then the blood will squirt out first, and then the pleural fluid will come out right afterward. A transparent fluid will come out. You remember John's gospel, of course, where he says one of the soldiers thrust a lance into the side. And of course, the gospel writer thinks it was water. So he said, out came blood and water. Truly, it was blood and transparent pleural fluid. But if you look on that shroud, it is perfectly evident that what you see right around the hole where the spear went in, you can see the blood first, the first thing that emitted. And then you can see the pleural fluid, and it is pleural fluid that is around the blood that is on the cloth. So that is, we only have, one, crucifixion where the Romans actually put someone out of his misery early by thrusting a spear into his side. The reason for this was, as we know in Jesus's gospel, they weren't putting him out of his misery. He was already dead. They didn't even have to break his knees to kill him. All they did was just thrust that up as an assurance. It's a very unique dimension of crucifixions that has occurred in Jesus's history, and there we find the evidence exactly as described by the gospel writers. You can see in the third place that the whipping, the scourging of the man on the shroud. Now, notice first and foremost that the whip that was used was a Roman flagrum. The Roman flagrum had three straps, right? And at the end of each of the straps, there's like a little lead dumbbell. And so a medieval whip was with a single strap was not used. It was a three-strap Roman flagrum. You can see it's the exact length of a real Roman flagrum with the identifying features of the lead dumbbells in it. So there's a legionnaire to the left and to the right, and they're whipping the man in the shroud alternatively back and forth. As they're whipping him, those lead dumbbells stick right into the side of the man. And when they pull it back, they're literally shredding all the flesh from the side all along the backside of the man on the shroud. And it goes right from the neck all the way down to the ankles there. And it would have caused such a blood loss. In other words, they gave him the maximum number of scourgings that was permissible, well, certainly under Jewish law, but also the Romans were trying to please the Jewish authorities there. So you can pretty much see this guy lost so much blood. Little wonder he died, as was reported of Jesus. Little wonder they didn't have to break his knees to kill him, and just thrust the lance into his side. So it also explains, this scourging explains something really important. The beam of wood, as we shall see, was put on the shoulder of the man. Obviously probably the cross beam of the cross, or actually the whole cross itself, whatever the case. But Jesus was in the Gospels was too weak to carry this cross, and basically you can see from the physique of the man on the shroud, this is a big man for a Middle Easterner. He's clearly a Middle Easterner. You can judge that by his beard, his hairstyle, his nose, etc., his cheekbones. Clearly, this man is a Semitic man, but he's a big Semitic man, probably 5'10" or a little bit more. He's got a very muscular physique. How is it possible that he could not carry this cross? Pure and simple, he lost way too much blood in the scourging and continued to lose blood, because certainly this would not, have been solidified. The blood wouldn't have been solidified, by the time he was, the cross was put on him. Let's take a look at also the piercing in the hands and the feet. You can see that we only have, unfortunately, one image of the piercing of the hand. It's the exit wound that's coming out of the hand. What you can notice, though, is that exit wound occurs right here on the wrist. And you feel that little V complex there that's on your own wrist. What Dr. Frederick Zugabe did the study for this, and what he shows is that the nail that produced that image was coming down at an angle. And so he reasons that the nail goes right in here in the lower part of the palm, and you see this little crease in your hand here. The nail follows this crease, which is called the thenar furrow, and it comes right out here by this complex of nerves, right in this little V area of your wrist. Now, why is that important? Because that means, with the nail coming out there, the bones in the wrist will adhere the hand and the wrist to the wood of the cross. So if you put it straight through the palm, it's all fleshy. It would have just pulled away. So the Romans, they knew what they were doing by pushing this down that little thenar furrow, and of course just getting it to come out the complex of nerves in the wrist. Now, that would have been, of course, more painful. So this again corresponds to Jesus's crucifixion, nailed to the cross, and we can see that it nailed right there in the lower palm. Also, we don't have this from the scriptures, but a lot of the mystics have told us that Jesus fell. During his journey on the cross, and we have that from many mystics throughout the centuries, and that seems exceedingly probable by the evidence on this shroud. You can see first that the man has a contusion right in the middle of the right shoulder, so you can see essentially that this big bump that's kind of coming out of his shoulder, and you can see that there's an 11-degree slope in the clavicle. So basically his shoulder was not broken, but it was dislocated. So, that it sort of, collapsed down, and that's why his arm is extended on the shroud. And people were always saying, well, it seems like his right arm's too long. Well, that's because his shoulder was dislocated, and you can clearly see the evidence of the dislocation. So what happened? We can see abrasions on the man's knees. So it looks like what happened is the man is carrying the cross, and as he's going, he trips on something, or he, out of sheer weakness, he kind of lurches forward and then slams down onto the ground. So he falls directly onto his knee. The wooden beam that's on his shoulder goes up in the air, and wham! It hits him right where the contusion is, in the middle of the right shoulder. And of course, it not only dislocates the shoulder, but it jerks his head to the left. And of course, his right eye gets pulled into its orbit. This is exactly what we would expect, and this is exactly what we find on the actual shroud. So again, this is really uncannily similar to Jesus's unique history with the Roman weaponry all along the line, and a Syrian crown with a Syrian thorn, with a Roman flagrum, with an elliptical spear, proceeding into the between the fifth and the sixth ribs, etc. Okay, so I think this pretty much is this the crucifixion of Jesus. I think it is. I think there is data here that no medieval forger could have known about anatomically that corresponds to the unique elements of Jesus' crucifixion, and so I think it is really pretty good evidence that this is uniquely the crucifixion of Jesus that's portrayed in perfect anatomical accuracy relative to the image. Okay, let's go to the actual image production itself and the resurrection.
30-minute mark.
I'm sorry?
30-minute mark.
Okay, we're going to do this somewhat quickly here, but let's just start with the fact that, as I said before, it's the most unique image that we have in the world. We don't have any image like it. We can't find we only have one possible explanation. This has basically been analyzed by about 14 physicists who are trying to do image production, and a whole lot of people in histopathology and anatomy that have tried to bring this explanation to a conclusion. Let me just give you a summary. What are the 5 really unusual elements in this image? Number one, the image is not produced by any substance whatsoever. So it's not produced by powders or dyes or rubs or liquids, or it's not even produced by, any kind of scorching. There's no outside substance that's used to produce the image. The image is intrinsic to the cloth. In other words, it is, whatever produced the image produced sort of a very, very fine etching on the uppermost surface of the fibrils. So it turns the fabric friable, crispy. And as the crispiness breaks away, you've got this etching right on the uppermost surface of the fibrils. And that's what produces that yellow coloration, which in turn gives us a perfect three-dimensional image on this non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. So, for example, there are all these medieval forger hypotheses, where somebody used, powder on a block. Not this image was never produced by powder. Some say, that somebody had made a contact image with a human body. Couldn't have been a contact image. If you made a contact image, it would come out all wrong. No, there has to be because when you put the cloth on an irregularly shaped face, right, you're going to get disfigurations of the image that won't correspond to a human face in the way that it is. So we know none of these medieval forger explanations are going to work. But let's just skip there and let's get to the second enigmatic feature of the image itself. Number two, it's on the uppermost surface of the fibrils. Once again, we can see that this could not be produced by, in other words, the image never penetrates to the middle of the fiber or the middle of the cloth. So the image is right there on the supersurface of the cloth, as I said, in this very distinctive etching, fine etching. So again, we know that the image couldn't be produced by a liquid. A liquid would have penetrated to the middle of the fiber, the middle of the cloth. It would have spangled into the adjacent fibers, et cetera, et cetera. So you can't do it with rubs. You can't do it with scorching. You can't do it with, any known, chemical substance. It just cannot be produced. You're going to have to find another explanation for it. So we get to the third unique feature of this image. And that is, there are a lot of places on the shroud that could have never made contact with the actual body. If it had made contact with every, the cloth had made contact with every part of the body, it would have made such an irregular and crazy image. You could tell automatically. So there had to have been a lot of places where the cloth did not touch the body. Well, you know what that means automatically. Action at a distance. And every guy who's in that, every person in your audience there who studied physics knows action at a distance. That's radiation, radiation, radiation. It's the only possible way of having action at a distance. So we shall see. It's the only explanation for the actual fine etching on the uppermost surface of the fibrils of the cloth that's not going to be produced by any known substance. Let's get to the fourth element. This is a real enigmatic one. The fourth element is that image is three-dimensional. It's like an MRI. In other words, the shading differential in the fine etching on the uppermost surface of the fibrils, it's so refined. It literally is encoding the precise distance that the radiation is moving from the cloth, from the body to the contact point on the cloth. So you can actually see that this is like an MRI with three-dimensional encoded imaging on it in this precise etching. And of course, you can take a VP8 image analyzer from NASA. You can resolve the three-dimensional encoding on the cloth, and you can turn that into a very nice statue of this man, a Middle Eastern man with his fine physique, and it's going to be in super good shape. It's actually going to look like a human being. It's not going to have any irregularities in it that would be produced by trying to do it by contact imaging, etc. Okay, let's get to the fifth and final dimension. This again, such an really difficult feature to explain. What is it? There's imaging from the inside of the body. This is utterly bizarre. And in other words, you've got imaging of the backbone inside the body, and you can you can see that in perfect three-dimensional proportionality to the flesh surrounding the backbone. You can see that also with the excuse me. You can see that also with the bones inside the hands relative to the flesh surrounding the bones in the hands, etc. So we know that that cloth has to have, some form, some way of getting, to the imaging in the cloth. So either the shroud had to penetrate the body and the body turned mechanically transparent, or the actual imaging from the actual backbone had to reach through the flesh that surrounded it and get up to the shroud. That's the only two ways that you could have this this inside imaging on the body. Okay, I'm going to cut to the chase because of the shortness of time, but I'll be happy to take any questions on this during the Q&A session. Basically, as we said before, there's only one possible explanation for this. It's not contact, it's not liquids, it's not dyes. It has to be radiation with a capital R. Well, two kinds of radiation have been identified by very, very fine physicists who have examined this over the course of a long, long time. Dr. Kitty Little at Harwell labs in Great Britain, Jean-Baptiste Renaudot at Grenoble and Institut Physique in Paris. Obviously, Dr. Arthur Lind here in the United States. Dr. John Jackson, a variety of other people have looked at this. The main thing to see with this radiation, it can be of two kinds. The first kind of radiation is what's called vacuum ultraviolet radiation. This only explains about half the enigmas on the image and the cloth. So only one half. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but vacuum ultraviolet radiation will explain some of the enigmas. And of the five I mentioned, it will explain 3 of the 5 enigmas I just mentioned. The other one that Dr. Kitty Little and Jean-Baptiste Renaudot, Arthur Lind and company, the other explanation, Tom Phillips, etc., that has been forwarded is particle radiation. I'm just going to give you the explanation here very, very quickly and tell you how it explains, some of these enigmas that I've just talked about. Particle radiation, essentially, the theory is this, that the body itself underwent a low temperature nuclear reaction, and it went across the entire body. The stable atomic nuclei in the body is undergoing some form of nuclear decay, at this time. And the nuclear decay that's taking place there is giving rise to 2 big particle flows. One is a neutron flux or a neutron emission or a neutron flow, that's coming out of the body. And the second one is a proton deuteron flux. So the heavy charged particles are moving out of the body. Now, I'll just say this preliminarily, if you're going to have, a low temperature nuclear reaction going across a human body after death, that's literally leading to nuclear decay, to produce this neutron flow and this proton deuteron flow. The odds of this happening by pure chance in a dead body are about the same as a monkey typing the first 2 acts of Macbeth perfectly by random tapping of the keys in a single try. In other words, hey, if this happened, it's a miracle. I mean, you're going to have supernatural explanation to get through this baby. But nevertheless, there's a lot of evidence that this is exactly what happened, and we have a way even of conclusively proving it. So hang on to this for just a moment. Let's take a look, though, at how the explanation works. So basically, you have this proton-deuteron flux, right? These are heavy charged particles, and they're coming off the body from the nuclear decay. Of course, there's other things, alpha particles and electrons and things are coming off too. But those deuterons, they're coming. What they do is they interact with the electrons and so forth in the surface of the cloth. So when those proton-deuterons that are heavy but charged, when they hit the uppermost surface of the fibrils, get it? When they hit that very, very uppermost surface, never penetrating to the middle of the fiber of the cloth, they stop. And what do when they hit that cloth and stop? They produce an exceedingly fine etching of that cloth. And that fine etching that was, Kitty Little and, Dr. Kitty Little and Jean-Baptiste Renata, what they showed was it actually, that etching turns that straw-like yellow coloration that you see in that image of the shroud, which of course can be resolved to a perfect three-dimensional photographic negative image on a non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. So that is a really good, it covers everything. The proton-deuteron flux. The neutron flux covers even more stuff. So in other words, we are very sure that a series of neutrons came right off of that body. We'll talk about the evidence for that. But first of all, for example, when neutrons come off a body, they're going to go, and they're going to irradiate everything in their path. But since they don't have a charge, they're going to go zooming through the cloth, and they're probably going to be bouncing around right in the tomb there, which is a limestone tomb, and so you're going to get some neutron irradiation in the tomb, and you're going to get neutron irradiation in the cloth and the blood on the cloth. Now, why is this important? Because remember those 372 bloodstains. All the bloodstains on the Shroud of Turin are bright red. Those of you who work in the healthcare profession, that blood turns from bright red to dark red to brown to black. And of course, the bloodstain should become black, as a whole, in a couple of weeks in the open air. Not these bloodstains, bright red. Why? Because when you irradiate blood with neutrons, it turns first, and then you take that irradiated blood and you put it in some ultraviolet light, like a sunshine at an exhibition. You do that, and they all turn bright red. And that's Dr. Goldini actually discovered this, been shown time and time again. Clearly neutrons are an explanation for this, but as we shall see, it's an explanation for the strength of the cloth. I won't have time to get into that today. I want to just talk about those 5 enigmas now and just show you how the neutron flux and the proton-deuteron flux are going to explain them. Then get back to the carbon dating and show why it advances the carbon dating the way that it does. And then I'll just wind it up with a quick conclusion. The main thing to recognize, first of all, is that first enigma, that it's not produced by any image. That's it. By any substance. That's it. You don't have powders. You don't have dyes. You don't have liquids, rubs, paints, anything like that. You don't need any extrinsic substance to produce this image. The fine etching that turns into straw-like coloration, that is produced by on the uppermost surface of the fibrils by the proton-deuteron flux that hits the uppermost surface of the fibrils and stops. So 2 enigmas already explained. The third enigma, of course, radiation. We don't have any problem there. The third enigma. So in other words, there's no contact made between, all along the side of the face where, the cloth has to go up over the nose. And so you can see that, there's all the places. You don't have to worry about not having contact. Radiation produces the imaging regardless of contact or not. Okay, then you go to the 4th enigma. How about that 3-dimensional imaging? Particle radiation will do it because particle radiation is so refined that it can actually encode it. In other words, the variation in the darkness of the yellow straw-like coloration, this comes from the depth of the penetration in the cloth. So the further away something is, the less penetration there is in that fine etching on the uppermost surface of the fibrils. And of course, the closer it is, the more penetration there is. That's what encodes the three-dimensional imaging. So particle radiation, again, is our best culprit for explaining this, our best cause for explaining this. And finally, of course, the imaging from the inside. Just think about it. So, of course, this body is, decaying. So the nuclear constituents are beginning to decay. And what's happening when the flesh from the surface of the body is decaying, it decays at the same time as the backbone that's in the cloth. But what's happening, of course, is it's a little nearer to the cloth. So the first thing is the surface, the flesh particles break up. But when they break up, they're on their way. Then, of course, the next layer, it has to catch up that microscopic little distance, though. That's enough time for it to catch up. And, of course, the path is clear. The path is clear. You just keep right. Everything, is getting out of the way by, of course, undergoing nuclear decay. And, of course, by the time you get to the backbone particles, they have a clear path right to the cloth, and they can be encoded with three-dimensional imaging. Okay, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we always wonder too, how in the world you could have equal intensity of imaging on both the frontal part of the cloth and the dorsal part of the cloth. After all, the body's lying in supine position right on the dorsal part of the cloth. Force of gravity is acting on it. The cloth that's on the top, the part of the cloth, the front part of the cloth on the top, doesn't have that force. How could the dorsal image, by any stretch of the imagination, should be darker and more, clear than the frontal part? How come they're of equal intensity? All right, you guys, in every low temperature nuclear reaction, guys in physics, you know what happens. A vacuum is created. And when a vacuum is created, the frontal and the dorsal side will be pulled toward the center at an equal intensity in that split second in which the decay is occurring. One thing, again, explain that why is the cloth so resistant to solvents, has lasted so long, things that have thrown people off for years ago. How can this cloth be 2,000 years old? It's so strong. It's so resilient. It looks so good. It resists everything. Neutrons. Because those neutrons, they go blasting through that cloth and they break up all of the weak linear carbonyl links. And what do? They reconstitute themselves as crystalline carbonyl links in the cloth. Okay, so and those crystalline carbonyl bonds, those are very strong. They're double bonds, and they make the cloth. And by the way, that's exactly what we have in the shroud. We have that double bonded cloth. Okay, how will we go ahead and prove that this particle reaction, this nuclear, this nuclear reaction produced the two fluxes? How would we prove it? The presence of cosmogenic isotopes. In other words, if you really had a low temperature nuclear reaction in there, you would have some isotopes that are generally produced, somewhere out in the cosmos, nearby, various kinds of, stellar or solar phenomena that are very intense indeed on the nuclear level. To make a long story short, if we find chlorine 36 and calcium 41, if we find those cosmogenic isotopes in some abundance on this cloth, there's going to be no doubt in the world, no doubt that the low temperature nuclear reaction, which caused the degradation, that caused the proton deuteron flux and the neutron flux, that's the cause of this. Now let's just return then. So what happened, in that tomb? Do you need really supernatural explanation to move toward it? What happened is when this body as a whole starts undergoing nuclear reaction and decay, when that actually happens, all at once, you are going to get a very bright light and a boom. And simultaneous with that, you're going to get that neutron flux, that neutron flow, and that proton deuteron flux, which is producing all of these effects on the clock. In fact, the particle radiation hypothesis explains all 42 enigmas on the clock. So again, you have this bright light, this boom, these two fluxes of particles that are occurring, that are producing this image. It's literally the image is being constituted by the very particles that constituted Jesus's, or the man in the shroud's body, which I obviously consider to be Jesus's body. And of course, at the end of the day, is this natural? Does this have a naturalistic explanation? Well, if monkeys can type the first two acts of Macbeth by random tapping of the keys perfectly in a single track, sure, that has got a natural, but of course, that's ridiculous, absurd. And so, in my belief, this was actually produced by supernatural causation. I do think, that this low temperature accompanied by nuclear degradation and accompanied by the fluxes, I think this was made to happen, contrary to what would normally happen in a dead body, and of course, even a crucified dead body. I think, secondly, that this also resembles the passion of Jesus perfectly. I think it gives credence to the gospel testimonies of the crucifixion down to the last jot. It is really amazing how that was done. It explains how the image got on the shroud after the blood, right? So in other words, the blood is there, right? It adheres to the body when the body is put into the shroud. And then later, of course, during the time of the resurrection, this would have to be, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 36 to 48 hours later, you're beginning, you got this image that is being produced by this high intensity particle radiation with the light and the boom, and that explains how it could be done with perfect anatomical accuracy. Frankly, I think the preponderance of evidence not only favors this explanation, that it certainly is Jesus. No medieval forger could ever produce anything like this, not using any substance of any kind, etc. Fine etching on this. How in the world would he have any tools, enough to do it? You can only replicate it in a laboratory, by very, very special and technical, equipment. So to make a long story short, I think God, Jesus had a plan in mind 2,000 years ago. He thought to himself, what am I going to do for a nice, skeptical scientific generation to just get them really baffled into thinking, well, wow, maybe there was this powerful, miraculous event that produced this image 2,000 years ago on the shroud. Maybe I'll just implant all those clues right on the shroud and let them find out for themselves, find the cosmogenic isotopes, and just wink at them and go, gotcha. I think really that's the best explanation of this most unique and scientifically investigated historical artifact in the history of humankind. I think it is a relic of Jesus' passion and his powerful and glorious resurrection. Thanks so very much for your kind attention, and then I'd open it up to whatever questions you may have. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Spitzer. That was incredible. I really appreciated yeah, another round of applause. Heck, let's just go for it. I really appreciated the point about the soldier thrusting the spear into Jesus' side and like how much historical and scientific data supports that. It's a detail I always looked over, so I, really appreciate that point.
Sure.
Yes, so at this point, we have some time for Dr. Spitzer to answer some of the questions that you submitted online. The first question we have is from Maria. She wants to know, Father Spitzer, how would you respond to the claim that the science behind the shroud is biased? Are there scientists who are skeptical of the shroud?
Well, the scientists who actually, yes, there are scientists who are skeptical of the shroud. However, I hasten to add the caveat, not the scientists who have examined the shroud. And all the scientists who have examined the shroud were not, thoroughly convinced of its authenticity. They were as curious as you and I are when they started off on this. You could say that the ones who were Christian or something of that nature were certainly would have liked the shroud to have turned out, but do I think that it produced an overall bias? No, I think you had actually Jewish scientists that worked on this, and I think some of the best evidence that we have and the blood evidence, et cetera, were produced by people who were thoroughly unconvinced of it. And I think a lot of people were, most of the scientists who investigated the particle radiation hypothesis, really, were pretty much stunned, by just how beautifully all the puzzle parts fit together with the empirical testing of it. So, I would invite, any scientist who's skeptical, who's interested in examining we're going to have another investigation of the shroud, right? The first thing we have to do is we have to investigate the cosmogenic isotopes. And secondly, we want a strict confirmation that in fact neutrons did cause the advancing of the carbon-14 in the cloth. I mean, right now we have Dr. Thomas McAvoy and Dr. Tom Phillips, Robert Rucker, have produced a very, very good and credible theory that neutrons not only produced, that it produced the fluorescing on the cloth. You can see from the fluorescing on the cloth that the further a body part is, the further the cloth is from a body part, you can see that the fluorescing is more reduced. So it's less in intensity, and the closer it is to the body, the greater in intensity. Again, neutrons do produce this effect on the cloth. They do produce intensity of fluorescing. We see the very same thing. If you take that 8-centimeter sample that was taken from the shroud, there is literally over 100 years differential between 8 centimeters, right? 2.5 inches, whatever it is. There's literally over 100 years differential between the edge of the shroud of the sample that's closest to the body to the edge of the sample that's furthest from the body. How can you get 100-year differential in an 8-centimeter sample? Really easy, because of course, if the neutron emission is coming from the body, you can actually use this Monte Carlo end particle software to determine how much neutron density there will be on every part of that cloth according to the number of inches away from the body it is. And where the edge is on that shroud, it's 94 years per inch, or whatever the case. I think that's the correct 36 years per centimeter. So that's basically it. And you can see that the variation in the sample is explained very clearly there. So if you put all this together, I do think, in our next test, I am very confident that we will see, and believe me, there's going to be people all over this, right? Like a bee on honey, because they're going to want to say, hey, the closer to the body, we should get even greater movement into the future. And finally, if you get right next to the body, you're going to be in the future. In other words, you're not going to be in the past anymore. There's going to be so much C14 in there. It's going to be predicting that cloth came literally from the future, which of course is impossible. And that obviously means that there was a lot of C14 abundance produced by the neutron emission in reaction with the N14. So I think with all those things that come upon it, all the skeptical scientists will have their chance. But to simply, I just read the other day, some guy said, "Well, I just made a contact, impression of a man's face, and I can see from the contact impression that there are all kinds of irregularities on the face. So that proves that the shroud, was clearly a forgery." That's the opposite of scientific methodology. Hey, if your predicted hypothesis for how to produce the image is a contact image, and you see that the contact image is nowhere near anything like on the Shroud of Turin, you shouldn't conclude to the forgery of the shroud. You should conclude to the invalidity of your method for explaining and producing the image. I was laughing so hard I couldn't believe it. So some of this skepticism, honestly, is like, oh, come on now, and then Gerlicelli and those guys were literally, they were taking, a broom and trying to, paint on, blood to see, how this would, affect, a body and the impressions and things of that nature, fall prey to the same tautological argument. My method, doesn't work, so therefore the shroud is wrong. That's not how the blood got on the shroud to begin with. So it disproves it. So I would say this: there are really good skeptical scientists who want to see the evidence, and they, I think, should be absolutely on board to at least watch the photographing of what's going on. If not, several of them be present at the next investigation of the shroud. I think the shroud should pass muster, and so I think we'll find cosmogenic isotopes on it. I definitely think you'll find the carbon dating will be, as the Monte Carlo end particle software will show. I think there'll be complete correspondence between the new dating of the cloth and the various parts of the cloth and the Monte Carlo end particle program. So I welcome all of the people, the skeptics, to be part of it. And I think, like most of the previous skeptics, I think people will either be befuddled beyond belief or just say, as many scientists have done, that this is the real deal. Something like a low temperature nuclear reaction, accompanied by nuclear degradation, produce that image. And certainly the blood stains, there's just no way we have to retest those. That's been tested, retested again. Clearly it's human blood. Clearly it arrived on the shroud prior to the image being produced, and clearly it depicts uniquely Jesus's crucifixion. So anyway, that'd be my quick answer.
Thank you, Father Spitzer. I'm sure Maria very much appreciated your answer.
All right. So our next question comes from Dakota, who asked, how could all 5 enigmatic features be so distinct if Jesus only spent 3 days in the tomb?
Well, the enigmatic features are actually, they were produced by this one event. So in other words, it's the particle. This happens like in a split second. It's not even 3 days. The image gets onto the cloth in literally a split second. So you've got this simultaneous nuclear decay and low temperature reaction going across the body, which is going light, boom, particle fluxes, image, etched into the cloth, bam, cease. So within like maybe 2 seconds, the whole thing's done. I mean, it's there, and the actual particle constituents of what I consider to be Jesus's body would be constituting the very image. It's not just a picture; it's constituting, producing the image that we see on the shroud. So we have both his blood and his protons and deuterons that are there. Of course, the neutrons pass right through the cloth, but the remnants of the irradiation of those neutrons is there, producing the bright color of the blood, etc. Great question, though, but it takes place in a few seconds.
All right. Thank you. I think Becca has another question for us.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you all for Sorry about that. Thank you all for your questions. We have a lot, so I apologize if we don't get to all of them. But we did get a question from Father John asks, what would it take for us to replicate this exact radiation? Can modern science replicate it exactly?
Right now, the only way you could do that, right now, we have no way of modern science replicating the image right now, because we would have to literally produce um, a low temperature nuclear reaction and degradation in a human body that we have no scientific instrument, that can do this. So we'd have to find a way of producing almost instantaneously, simultaneously, the nuclear degradation, low temperature nuclear reaction in a body that was clearly not designed to do this from a nuclear point of view. So, I mean, no, we cannot produce it right now. That means, but we can prove that such a reaction did happen. That would be, we can prove it by showing the cosmogenic isotopes. We can prove it by showing from 5 different data sources that you have a strong source of neutron irradiation that's coming from the body, and you can prove it, through a variety of other, ways of saying, well, there was a nuclear reaction, there was a nuclear degradation, there was a strong neutron flux, which is completely inexplicable by naturalistic means. But no, right now we don't have a human way to replicate it. Right now, we'd have to find some remarkable way of disrupting natural causation in physics. So that we do not have.
Thank you, Father Spitzer.
All right, so our next question comes from Jude, and she asks, is it significant that the blood type is AB? Is this normal or unusual for someone in the Middle East in the time of Jesus?
Well, there were certainly in the Middle East, AB blood type is there, but AB blood type, as everybody knows, universally is the rarest blood form, very rare compared with the other 3 blood types. It happens, the Eucharistic miracles, that's a whole other topic. The contemporary Eucharistic miracles at Buenos Aires, Tixla, and Sokolka, Pollen, all of those have AB blood type as well. It is the rarest kind of blood type. It's a universal receiver rather than a universal donor. Always a universal donor type. And people think, well, why was it the universal receiver was used? I think it's because it's the rarest blood type, and it would have been the hardest to kind of fabricate. The idea of a medieval forger trying to find somebody in the bottom 2% of blood types, and going out and finding that guy to produce the blood image, and then having it correspond to other things like the Eucharistic miracles, etc. Pretty remote. So I think maybe that's God's motive, but far be it from me to know. But Jesus did have AB blood type, and it was very rare back then too. And but it's everywhere present on the 372 blood stains.
All right, thank you.
The next question we have is from Charles, who asks, what triggered the body to emit so many radioactive particles?
That is the what's called the low temperature nuclear reaction, which engendered a nuclear decay. And that, if you're asking me what the cause of that was, because dead bodies don't normally do this. Like, they never do this. So the point, of course, is I believe it's a supernatural causation that triggered it to do it. I just do not see how we could explain it naturalistically, and certainly we don't have the technology to do that today.
Thank you, Father Spitzer.
All right, and we have another question which comes from John Paul, who asks, how did you first get interested in the shroud?
Actually, I got interested in it a long time ago, before the 1988 carbon dating, believe it or not. And, I had read several books. One of them was a guy named Paul Vignon. And Paul Vignon, he was not a scientist, but he was someone who actually was a iconographic specialist, and he was looking at, how the iconography of Jesus changed through the ages. You might recall what I was just saying about the journey of the shroud from Jerusalem, northern Judea, to Edessa, to Constantinople, and then to Europe. So, in other words, those pollen grains indicate just the exact journey that the shroud took. Well, what was so interesting was that Paul Vignon, just a few years before, said, Edessa, Turkey holds the secret to why the iconography of Jesus changed from a Roman Jesus to a Semitic Jesus. So the Roman Jesus, right, has a roundish face. Of course, the Semitic Jesus has a very, almost, elliptical kind of face, almost, a thin elliptical face. You can see that a Roman person is clean shaven. This man has a very long beard. You can see that, like a Semitic person. You can see that a Roman, has a very tight haircut. This man has very long hair, arranged and braided like a Semitic Jewish person, et cetera, et cetera. So Vignon is saying, this is really interesting. And what Vignon noticed was, this is before the pollen grains. He said, there is, excuse me, there are 17 areas of, just inexplicable features of the shroud. For example, there's a box-like cut that's right above the eyebrow of Jesus that shows up in icons of Jesus from Edessa, Turkey. But I'll talk about the Mandylion in just a moment. Now you look at that and you can see that right on the shroud, a box-like cut. Obviously, some soldier hits Jesus straight on with a fist, right? And it produces this cut above the eye and produces the swelling that raises the eyebrow. What Vignon noticed is that a unique feature of the shroud shows up in this Edessa iconography. And of course, he's got all of these other things that are there. And so, as he goes through all these things, I just thought to myself, wow, I mean, maybe the Shroud of Turin was the Mandylion. And maybe the Mandylion that caused all these enigmas in the iconography, starting with Edessa, Turkey, maybe that was a folded image of the Shroud of Turin, so that the image was folded and the face of the man is facing outward, but not the rest of the body on the frontal and dorsal side. Well, it just so happens that John Jackson, one of the physicists that had worked on this, using some X-ray spectrometry, he basically shows that you can, through just differentiation in the thin lines of the fluorescing, you can see that there were folds in the shroud. And he actually shows that the shroud was actually folded backwards so that only the face was showing out. And obviously, the reason it produced those folds is because it was creased. It was put into a wooden frame, and the wooden frame was scrunched it was tight enough to produce creases in the actual shroud. And we can still see the remnants of that creasing from fluorescing and imaging today. It looks like actually the shroud was the Mandylion, the face of Jesus that was reported there in Edessa that changed the iconography of Jesus. We can see it there. And so I looked at that and I just thought, wow, this is looking really interesting. And so I just, right from there, I just thought, I'm going to, get out and look at this thing and take it seriously, because there's just too much here. Too many coincidences. If it were just one enigmatic feature, it's 43 enigmatic features. if there were just one, thing that maybe you did say, well, gosh, that fluorescing, that varies, going out to the outer edge of the cloth, that's so unusual. Maybe that, could, portray something. But it's like there's a lot of them. And so you just say you compound all of these things with the blood saps, with the pollen, with the coincidence between the blood and Jesus's crucifixion. It's just too much. By the time you're done, there's about 100 things, causally that point to Jesus Christ and his passion and resurrection as reported in the scriptures. And that's why I think, you got to follow the evidence. I mean, no matter what you think, this thing is at least super enigmatic and super interesting. And that, I think, is enough reason to motivate anybody to look into it. And above all, take it seriously. This thing has undergone a lot of scientific testing, and it's worth looking at all of it because it could well be, and I believe it is, the burial cloth of Jesus Christ produced by the very powerful, nuclear reaction and low temperature nuclear reaction and of his resurrection and, of course, the blood of his crucifixion.
All right, thank you. I believe Becca's got another question for us.
Sure.
Yes, we have a question from Lincoln who asks, Pope Julius and Clement disagreed on the validity of the shroud.
Right.
And continued by, how does the shroud conflict with papal infallibility?
Well, of course, papal infallibility only applies in a very restricted area of what's called doctrine, magisterial doctrines. And so the shroud, the Pope never pronounces infallibly on anything scientific. So you'll notice that Pope Francis today will never say anything about the validity of the shroud, right? Because, of course, today it is a matter of science. Well, back in medieval times, it wasn't a matter of science. It was, they had some guy who claimed he did it, right? And so there was one guy who claimed he forged it, but he said he used a powder on blocks of wood. Well, we know that certainly was not the cause, and certainly could not have been the cause of the image on the shroud, because the shroud was produced, the image was produced by no substance. So, of course, if that's the reason why the Pope actually declared, oh, this was a forgery because some guy admitted to it, attested to it, certainly it could not be that. Certainly, too, there's one. A forger who said, I did it with contact imprint on a dead body. We know that couldn't possibly have been the cause of the image on it. You couldn't produce an image like the one on the shroud with contact imaging. So it's absolutely impossible that be the reason for the shroud. So what I would say is the Pope wasn't pronouncing infallibly. He was giving it what's called an opinion. And every Pope can give an opinion. And of course, this one Pope actually thought that, a forger actually, legitimately confessed to this. But I'll be really honest with you. Those confessions are simply easily disprovable because the means by which they supposedly did the forgery certainly did not produce the image on the shroud by any stretch of the imagination. And they couldn't have done it, certainly with the technology of their time. So I think, the Pope who declared that he believed it, again, he didn't do that either infallibly. He just, basically had his own reasons for holding that. Today, of course, as I said, Pope Francis and similar popes have stayed out of, making a declaration because really, the church is leaving this up to science to make the ultimate determination of whether the shroud is valid. And like I said, there are plenty of ways of actually validating this. Like I said, the presence of the cosmogenic isotopes, the presence of, we have to test several parts of the shroud to see whether it corresponds to the, elevation of the data. The shroud, corresponds to the closeness to the body, where the neutron density would have been the greatest. So if we can see all that stuff there, you could say there is a very good preponderance of evidence and a high probability that this shroud was produced by neutron and proton deuteron emissions. It probably went forward this way and give an explanation of it. You could then take a look at whether a miracle would be needed to do this. I think it will be. We don't even have a technology that can produce it, let alone nature itself right now. So with all this, in mind, I think, we await, the next scientific investigation. And I think we should invite skeptics to be part of that investigation. Absolutely. So that they can assure that the science that's being done is very credible indeed.
Wonderful. Thank you, Father. I think Connor has one more question.
So Helen asks, has there been a comparison between the cloth from Veronica and the shroud? Are there similarities?
Well, the Veronica veil, to be frank with you, the scientific testing on that is really thin. And so, I just don't want to make a comment on it. I just can't. But there is what's called the face cloth of Oviedo. Now, the face cloth of Oviedo, I didn't get into this tonight, but many of you will recall, that in John's gospel, when Peter and John go into the tomb, it says, the disciple, John, it says, I saw and I believed, and I saw the face cloth rolled over in a place by itself, and the linen cloth, in other words, it covered the body, the shroud, in another place. Now, that makes sense. So what is the face cloth? The face cloth is a cloth that was used generally when they took a body that had been, severely tortured. And in this case, the man was absolutely punched in the face, was absolutely, it was a very macabre scene, that terrible blood stains, pleural edema fluid flowing out of his nose, his jaw, kind of dropping. What they did was they took the face cloth and they put it around the face, holding the jaw up. It would absorb the pleural edema fluid coming out of the nose and the mouth. And then, of course, it would cover it over the terrible macabre face of this beloved man, as they're bringing him to the tomb. That was a customary practice. Then they would take the face cloth off the face, deposit it, lay the body on the fresh linen, inside this limestone tomb. And then, of course, you can see how it was, the body was put on the dorsal part of the cloth. Then the body was taken, then the cloth was taken and put over the head of the man and joined at the feet. And so you can see that it covered him that way. Now, why is that important, that face cloth of Oviedo? Because there are 120 blood stains and pleural edema fluid stains on that cloth, 120 of them. Those stains are, some of them are very small, some of them big, but there is 120 correspondences between the face cloth of Oviedo blood and pleural edema fluid and the pleural edema fluid and blood that we can see on the face of the Shroud of Turin. There is no way that did not touch the same face. Those two cloths had to touch the same face, crucified in the unique way of Jesus. Otherwise, you'd never get 120 points of congruence in the blood and pleural edema stain. Do you know the odds of this happening by pure chance? I just rest my case right there. So the key is then, well, what's the provenance that we have for the face cloth of Oviedo? We have one that goes all the way back to 616 AD. So in other words, this face cloth has to be either, 616 AD or earlier. And as we saw, there's a ton of other evidence that it's earlier from the wide angle X-ray scattering test and from the Fourier transformed inference spectroscopy test, et cetera. So we know that there's a good evidence that the face cloth goes back to that point. So it looks like what happened was that the two cloths, right? So you begin to have incursions, into Jerusalem. There's a destabilized community. Looks like the community in about 300 to 400 moves both the Turin cloth and moves the shroud and moves the face cloth of Oviedo to other places. So both of them go to Edessa, Turkey for a while. But then from Edessa, it looks like the face cloth went directly to Oviedo, Spain. And in about 700, the face cloth of Oviedo is placed in the Cathedral of Oviedo in this kind of strong box in the Cathedral of Oviedo. And it's there since 700 AD. Whereas with the shroud takes this circumlocution route up to Constantinople. Then during the 12th Crusade, by the way, Robert de Clary said that he actually saw the entire mandala in the face of cloth of Jesus. He saw it unraveled in the Cathedral of Saint Mary Blanchernay in Constantinople, and then later it was transferred to Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. So basically, what I'm saying is, even though they took two different paths, that face cloth of Oviedo, I am sure it is authentic as much as the Shroud of Turin. And I don't want to go so overtime here, but I just end up by saying this. When you do the carbon dating of the face cloth of Oviedo, it carbon dates to 700 AD. Now, let me just go back to those neutron emissions. So they bring the body into the limestone tube. And there's obviously several people here, not just Joseph of Arimathea, but people who are hastily trying to get this body ready before the Sabbath begins. They take the face cloth off of the body. And in those limestone tombs that are typical in Jerusalem, there is a little ledge that's there about 6 inches away from the actual head of Jesus. So you can see that the fellow takes this cloth off. This, of course, you're speculating here, but he puts it on that ledge, which would have been the most convenient place to put it, and then, to do the rest of the preparations with the shroud. Well, if you use that Monte Carlo N particle software to predict what the neutrons that would be there, and the reason there's going to be a few additional neutrons is, remember, neutrons can bounce off that limestone, so you're going to get a double effect sometimes there to produce a little bit more carbon-14 in the cloth. But anyway, Monte Carlo predicts the N-particle software predicts that if you're going to get neutron emissions over to that little ledge, which is maybe a good probable place for the face cloth to be put, the dating from the neutron emission that would have mixed with the N14 in that linen face cloth, it would have been about 700 AD should be the dating for that positioning of the face cloth. So all I'm saying is a lot of things are adding up here. And like I said, the coincidences are getting it's just too much to ignore. And to simplistically pass this thing off with the monstrous amounts of scientific data here that are coming together in an impressive mathematical coincidence, I'm telling you, that's just not right. Something of this nature deserves a real open-minded hearing, because there's a lot of overwhelming data and a whole lot of coincidence mathematically, not just in the carbon dating and the fluorescing that's intrinsic to the cloth and a variety of other things, right? But even in the blood stains and so forth. So I think, those two cloths, I have no problem with. But again, I just have no idea about, the face cloth of the Veronica veil that has been discovered It's just really thin scientific investigation at this point, but not with the face cloth of Oviedo. That's a solid piece of evidence.
All right. Thank you for all the insightful answers, Father Spitzer.
Thank you, everyone, for all of those wonderful questions. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you again, Father Spitzer, for your contribution to the Newman Lecture series and for your years of work studying the Shroud of Turin.
Thank you for the opportunity.